Mi intervju su evroambasadorot Deјvid Gir. Mr. Gir, welcome to MIA Press Center for this interview. I suppose you're first in this new 2024.
Indeed, Anna, it is my first, and let me start by wishing everyone tuning into this Sretna Nova Godina.
Thank you very much. Sretna Nova Godina to you also. Mr. Gir, you already came out with the position on the latest developments in National Air Navigation Service Provider. You stated that the state authorities to investigate allegations of cronyism in appointments of this service quickly, and also that you expect the state authorities to investigate reports of inappropriate external influence and violence against staff working and a National Navigation Service Provider. You had also a meeting with the president of the trade union, Tasevski, last week, I think, and you expressed concern and indicated that you are following the situation. Do you have any knowledge of how Eurocontrol reacts to what is happening in National Navigation Service Provider?
I'm not following what Eurocontrol is doing, but let's just back up a bit. We've obviously been following very closely the developments in this specific case, as it has been a huge public concern. My colleagues met with the union, I myself didn't personally. The position that we've expressed, I think, is very consistent with the position that we've taken regarding public appointments more generally, and that is, it's imperative that appointments to public institutions are made on the basis of merit. That means in terms of qualifications, experience and skills, not on the basis of political affiliation or personal ties. We've also said in this specific case that there are obligations on the part of the state to follow EU law, in particular related to the management of navigation services. In particular, the state needs to ensure a sufficient degree of independence of the body managing the navigation services, and also needs to ensure that appointments to key posts within the service itself should be in accordance with the legal qualifications, and also the human resources should be managed in such a way that they respect, first of all, safety, secondly, efficiency and cost effectiveness of the institution as a whole. And indeed, we called for these allegations related to inappropriate external influence, or indeed entering the premises, etc., to be investigated, and for the state authorities to take action depending on the outcome of those investigations.
Okay, and what if this kind of incident took place in the control tower in an European Union member state? What would be the consequences?
Well, at the moment we're talking about the allegations made, and this is a matter that is being investigated and should be followed up on. Our concern, as I've said, is, as shared by everybody, I think, is that safety is paramount. This is part of the critical infrastructure, and we expect the higher standards to be operating there.
We welcome 2024 with pressure coming both from outside and inside, countering high-level corruption. Also the enlarged US blacklist and the European Commission report that highlighted the swift amendments to the criminal code that led to expiry of the statute of limitation in large number of cases of former special prosecutor's office. As you see it, where did the system fail in this situation?
I think it's a good thing that there is such a strong emphasis in public discussion about corruption. Some people talk about endemic corruption, some talk about an epidemic, some describe it as a cancer. I mean, I think we're all talking about the same thing, that there is a level of corruption in public life, a prevalence of corruption, which is extremely concerning. It undermines, obviously, the economic potential of the country. It undermines innovation. It's one of those factors that drives people to leave the country. And of course, it's a source of inequality and injustice. And therefore, it is very concerning that the report produced by the European Commission last November says that there had been no progress in the fight against corruption. We would expect this to be one of the top areas where where the authorities should be active in fighting corruption. In particular, it did draw attention and our concerns related to the changes to the criminal code. Our concern at the time was that this would lead to more impunity.
Maybe misuse of European flag also in this situation.
And there was, of course, the misuse of a European flag. But our main concern was that this would perhaps increase the chances of impunity. And what we've seen in case after case, which is being, which is following up on this, we're seeing increased impunity. And indeed, we now see that there is a gap in the law in one specific area, which absolutely needs to be plugged as a matter of priority. Now, the report does say some positive things. It talks about the good work carried out by the Commission for the Prevention of Corruption to date, as well as the State Audit Office.
Yes.
Now, there have been elections, a new membership of the State Commission. We expect those members to perform to the same high standard as the previous members and to continue with the same determination and integrity. But of course, it can't just be for the State Commission or for the State Audit Office. It's
one step in all fight against the corruption.
Exactly. It needs to be an effort which brings everyone together, led by the authorities, including Parliament, media. You have a key role to play. I laud the efforts made by the investigative journalists we've seen in the past years, very important. Yes. Whistleblowers too.
But we already are witnessing pressures that are with slaps for the investigative journalists.
And that's why it's so important that the investigative journalists can get on with the job and shine a light on examples of corruption. We will do all we can to support efforts to combat corruption, but this needs to be led and needs to be a cross-society approach. One last thing, one area of corruption which we are concerned about, and that is the way in which over many years, not limited to one party, but over many years, there has been a practice of key positions being given on the basis of party affiliation. And
yes, like we have these last developments in MNF. Yes.
And that is a major concern. And I very much hope that the parties going into the elections this year will declare that they are committed to ending this practice of influencing appointments. It has a name. It's cronyism, nepotism. It's called corruption.
Yes, corruption is a problem for the Western Balkans. But no country is immune to this phenomena on some level, and some member states also face corruption, for example, in misuse of European funds. How does the European Union deal with the corruption?
I mean, you're absolutely right. Corruption is part of human activity, and therefore all states have to deal with it. The important thing, I think, is to have first of all, the institutions in place which can respond rapidly, can prevent corruption from happening, and can pick up the difficulties and the problems. It's not so much that corruption happens, it's how you react to corruption. And indeed, you've referred to within the European Union, we've seen the events in the European Parliament. Very important, the responses from the Parliament to that. So across the board, it's how you react, putting in place the mechanisms to prevent a reoccurrence of corruption, and also having a lack of tolerance for corruption at all levels. And of course that also means all of us being intolerant for corruption and speaking out when there are cases of corruption.
The report of the peer review mission for the Judicial Council arrived in December last month with 40 recommendations, 17 of which to be applied immediately. How much could these recommendations move things forward? Having in mind that in latest European Commission report, there was not noted any progress in strengthening of judiciary independence.
Starting with the Judicial Council, why is it important? It's because it is basically the guardian of the independence, professionalism and integrity of the judiciary. So it has a central role to play. So you can imagine last year in spring and autumn when we were seeing the Judicial Council taking acts which had no legal base, and this has now been confirmed by the Administrative Court as regards the dismissal of the then President of the Judicial Council.
It was noted in the report.
Indeed. Yes. So we were really concerned because we were seeing the Judicial Council failing on all of these accounts. And that's why we proposed to deploy a peer review mission. That means a group of experts judges from within the European Union who know how a judicial council should function. And what it did, it came up with a series of recommendations, as you said, 40. I think that speaks for itself.
Yes.
Not 5, it's not 10, it's not 15,
40.
it's 40, which I think is an indication of the extent of the problems that the Judicial Council has faced. Now, the Administrative Court has effectively taken a decision which has resulted in the reinstatement of Vesna Damevska
yes.
as president. It is really now an opportunity for the Judicial Council to act on the recommendations which it is able to act on.
Do you see it as a step forward?
That would be a step forward to start implementing these recommendations. And then, in reality now we're talking in a post-electoral election scenario, it will be for the new government, whatever it is, and the new parliament to act vigorously to ensure that the remaining recommendations are considered and put in place, so that we have a judicial council which is really doing its job and is really pushing back against external interference.
Did you give some framework in which this recommendation should be implemented?
Well, I think it's clear.
17 immediately, because there are no changes of laws, and for the
I
other...
think it's for what the Judicial Council needs to do, and it's not for me to tell them their job,
Yes,
but they need to look at the report, they need to look at the recommendations which they're able to implement from themselves, and see what can be done now, bearing in mind that they have a responsibility not to the peer review, not to the European Union. Their responsibility is to ordinary citizens who expect better from the judiciary than what they've seen so far.
In a retrospect of 2023, last year, what steered the public and maybe opened the issue whether things could have been done differently for North Macedonia is the so-called Orban coffee. During the EU summit in December, Ukraine and Moldova received the recommendation for the start of the EU accession negotiation with 26 yes, whereas the 7th that threatened a veto went to get a coffee during the vote, as suggested by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Was this possible in case with North Macedonia, or was it that no one stood firm behind the country as Germany did in this case?
First of all, it's important to see the decision to open accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova in the extraordinary context of Russia's illegal war against Ukraine, and also the reform steps that were put in place by both countries, although there is still a long way to go on that. But I think there's been quite a lot of misinterpretation by some commentators about the way in which the decision was taken. Let's be clear. The decision was taken at 27. In other words, by unanimity, all member states. It did not change the fundamentals. It did not find a smart, the fact that one country was not in the room was not some kind of smart workaround which removes the unanimity requirement. It doesn't provide a solution to a situation where you have one or more member states with a fundamental disagreement. Unanimity remains, and that, in this case, was a decision of the 27. But there is a solution already on the table, and that was a solution that was agreed in July 2022, which allowed North Macedonia to open accession negotiations, which it did. It launched the screening process, completed it. Now, in order to move to the next step, in line with that agreement from July 22, it's necessary to make these changes to the constitution regarding citizens who self-identify as Bulgarian. That's, of course, a choice for the country. It's a sovereign decision, but there is no further decision by the EU member states that's needed here. It's really in your hands.
Although the question over the possibility already mentioned of changing the negotiation framework is regularly asked, and the answer is always no, could there be any changes in the future of EU decision-making process upon this Orban coffee model?
I mean, two different things here. First of all, about...
This is like finished work with our negotiation framework?
Okay, so concerning... First of all, the first implicit question is, could there be a better deal? And I followed the discussions that took place between the autumn of 2020 and then the agreement in July 2022. It was very difficult, very intensive. compromises were made on both sides. Neither side, neither Bulgaria nor North Macedonia, was 100% happy, but that's in the nature of the compromises. What it did, though, was it allowed North Macedonia and Bulgaria to put behind these issues and look forward and move forward decisively. Do I think a better deal could be negotiated? Sincerely, I don't see that happening. Is the EU ready to reopen the negotiating framework? I think that the European Union is not looking at reopening the negotiation framework. It is an agreement that's been reached, and now we're looking forward and looking at many other issues which are piling on the agenda, including, we hope very much, this country moving forward decisively on its European path.
But the situation is as it is. The opposition did not support the constitutional changes, a process that opened in the parliament and is still opened due to the lack of the required majority. ВМРО-ДПМН leader Hristijan Mickoski has constantly said that even after coming to power, forming the future government, he would seek for another solution. Let me ask you again in some other modification of this question, what other solution could be there for North Macedonia in this European integration process?
Well, if the path is towards the EU and accession negotiations, I think what needs to be done is clear. There was an agreement from July 2020. We have opened accession negotiations. The screening process has been successfully completed, and now constitutional changes need to be made, and then the country can move forward to tackle these key issues that we were talking about at the beginning, issues such as the rule of law, the fight against the corruption, really focusing on the things that will change people's lives.
But in situation with Ukraine and Moldova, for example, considering the new geopolitical developments, as you mentioned, unlegal war, Russia war in Ukraine, the enlargement policy is now more than ever a geostrategic investment in long-term peace, security and stability. However, North Macedonia did not start a negotiation and Western Balkans is not fully integrated in this moment. Can the delay have security consequences? Taking into account that the decision on Ukraine and Moldova have a security background?
I mean, I think I fully agree with you that in recent years, in particular since the war against Ukraine, we've seen that enlargement is viewed not just through a question of prosperity, living standards, and democratic values. That's incredibly important, all of that. But it's also seen through the lens of security and stability. You know, earlier today, I had an event with the Minister of Defense, and we were celebrating the support that the European Union is providing to the army of this country in terms of equipment, defense cooperation. There are many other areas touching on stability and security where we're working together. Border control, the fight against extremism, hybrid threats, disinformation, cyber, all are areas where we're working closely together because the benefits of enlargement are also in the security and stability area. And I think this will only increase over time. So we hope very much to intensify our efforts, and as the country moves towards the European Union. So not only does it become more prosperous, but it also becomes more stable and more secure. And I'm confident that we can move in that direction.
Mr. Gir, how realistic is the 2030 target as a year for EU accession, and how can one make prediction at this time, considering that the Union is having elections this year and the change in top positions? There are also elections in some European state countries also this year.
Many elections this year, including
yes,
in this country,
and
maybe starting on this country.
Yes.
I mean, I think we expect, as citizens expect, for this country to, again, hold elections in accordance with democratic
Yes, we are
standards.
facing double elections this year.
Indeed.
Yes.
And we expect them to be carried out, implemented in accordance with democratic standards. And I hope very much that the different contestants and the different parties will use the opportunity to put before citizens the choice, what their programs are, what their objectives are, where they want to take the country, so that citizens have a real choice. Now, concerning the European elections themselves, I'm not going to speculate. That's really the work for pundits and for pollsters. But it's clear that at the end of last year, the European Union made a very clear, strong commitment, once again, to the accession path of not just Ukraine and Moldova, but the Western Balkans. And that commitment is based on the idea of reform. That's the key question. If this country progresses on reform, it will join the European Union. And it's not a theoretical and an abstract thing. We know what needs to be done. We've just spent a year doing incredibly intensive work on identifying in every different sector exactly what needs to be done. The country has developed roadmaps in certain areas as well. So the steps that need to be taken are very practical and very clear. If you take those steps, then you will join the European Union. But there's no way around that.
Yes. At the beginning of November, the European Commission put forward the growth plan for Western Balkans. According to announcement, the first funds to this plan will be transferred at the start of the, I think, second quarter of this year, 2024. How realistic is for this to happen in April, considering the procedures within the European Union?
The growth plan, I think, is a big opportunity, because what it's trying to do is to try and stimulate growth here in the Western Balkans. It's been pretty poor, it's been pretty pale level of growth. We want to see a much stronger growth, economic growth and improvement in living standards. That makes a real difference to people and also brings the country much closer to the European Union. And what's radical and new about this proposal, and some of the ideas came from this country and from the region itself, is to make available some of the benefits of the European single market to the country before you join, remembering that the single market is the real driver of growth within the European Union itself, together with very substantial investments from the EU side, both in the form of grants and loans, up to a possible maximum of 6 billion euros, still all of this being discussed with the member states, based on a commitment on this side to implement specific reforms so that if you have access to those parts of the market, you can compete on a level footing and you're also not a drain on the market, or you're not undercutting the European standards, and also a commitment for integration within the region, removing barriers across the Western Balkans to trade and to economic activity in line with EU standards. And with all of this taken together, we hope to be able to boost the economies of the region and therefore speed up accession to the European Union.
Mr. Gir, thank you for this interview for MIA.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.